There we go.
Okay.
All right. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Thanks for sitting tight as we kind of work out our technology issues. There are always some on the day of. We're so excited to be here, and we're so excited that Kathleen could come and present to us today. When we first were going to share this program, we were a little nervous about how many people would sign up. We were excited for it, but we thought, well, you know, we're not sure if people are going to sign up in 2 weeks. Maybe we need to have it available for longer. And then we finally put it up, and of course the in-person sold out in about under an hour. So it was really, really exciting to us that people are interested in this and want to learn more. So it's a testament to Kathleen and the amazing work that she's doing. I'm just going to give her a little introduction here, and then we'll get started. So Kathleen is a fourth-year doctoral student in First Nations and Education at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. She's a co-editor of The Great Vanishing Act, Blood Quantum and the Future of Native Nations. And for the past decade, she's worked in a variety of capacities in Indigenous communities in both here in Wisconsin and in North Dakota. She's doing amazing work for her doctoral. She's doing work on the Three Sisters Gardens, and I'm sure she could tell us more about that too, and she'll kind of introduce herself in the presentation. But I want to welcome Kathleen and thank her for being here today, and thank you all for coming. So without further ado, Kathleen.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Poso, Uju, Kinika, Gigiwi. My name is Kathleen Rattery, and I'm very excited to be here with everyone today to talk about the First Nations of Mugasuch, which is the HoChunk name for what is now called Door County and Door Peninsula.
You can listen to it on your phone.
So I'm still here. I'm going to mute. I think this needs to mute. Yeah. Oh, for the.
Excuse me, I've just got a blank screen here.
Yeah.
And you might just have to do that every once in a while as people come.
I just got a blank screen here. Is there an image to go with this?
There should be. Can everybody
I can see people at the top.
If you can see the presentation being shared?
No.
Okay. All right. So if you are having trouble viewing the presentation, you can try exiting the presentation and coming back into it, and we can let you in.
Yeah. What's up? Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think we're good to go.
Okay. All right. And if it's okay, just while I'm speaking, I will take my mask off and then I'll put it back on at the end. So good morning, everyone. It's good to see everybody here. Thank you all for braving the snow this morning. Let me just go. So this is right now where we are sitting in this town hall right now. We are on Indigenous land here. So this is the land acknowledgement from the ridges, recognizing that the property where the ridges sits now and where we are right now in Bailey's Harbor is the original ancestral homelands of the Potawatomi, Menominee, Odawa, Sauk, Ojibwe, Petun, Nokwe. Lots and lots of different peoples have called this land home. Some more permanently than others. Others kind of moved in and out, which we'll talk more about that. So I want to start with that recognition and that gratitude for being here on this beautiful day in this beautiful place and learning some interesting stuff together. And I know that many of you might be long-term residents here and you have knowledge as well that I hope you'll share with me because I am always learning. So I recognize that I still have a lot to learn and I'm excited to learn from you as well. So this is just a little bit about me and my family. So I am a mother, I'm a wife, I'm an author and a gardener, and a non-native ally, meaning that I am not Indigenous, but I have taken on the responsibility in my life to learn more and to try to decolonize my own perceptions of the world around me and the peoples that are around me, and to take action to recognize the Indigenous peoples that have been here for millennia and are still here today. So my, like Anna said, I am a current doctoral student at UWGB in the very first doctoral program at GB, which is the First Nations in Education. It's an EDD, educational doctorate program, and it's a completely unique program. It's an amazing program. And we are the first cohort to go through. So we were the guinea pigs in this program, kind of ironing out the wrinkles as we go. And we're now, the third cohort is coming through. So it's very exciting to be part of that learning community. So the dissertation that I'm working on, which I will be defending next fall, is the creation of a Three Sisters garden. Three Sisters are the corn, beans, and squash that many Native peoples have grown together, like the first companion gardening, and turning it into a teaching and learning garden at Fallen Timbers Environmental Education Center, which is in Black Creek, not too far from the Oneida Reservation. So there are some pictures here of some 6th grade students from West Deep Pier Intermediate learning about the plants. We grow Tuscarora white corn, we grow skunk beans, which are more delicious than the name suggests, and Buffalo Creek squash. So these are heirloom varieties that Indigenous peoples have grown for a long time. So that's kind of part of that food sovereignty effort to bring these varieties back and to teach climate resilient agriculture, sustainable agriculture in the process by drawing from these old teachings, Indigenous teachings. In the bottom left corner, there's a picture of the wild rice group. Wild rice got on the wild rice today. So that, which I have worked with a little bit, is bringing wild rice back and revitalizing the ecosystems along the way. So that is pretty exciting stuff. And this is my learning community at UWGB. This is the First Nations program centered in Indigenous knowledge systems, draws upon Indigenous teaching and learning methods for the purpose of promoting and protecting the sacredness of the earth and all living things. So we have elder teachers in the program, and they are recognized and paid as faculty, which is amazing. And that is a new thing that you don't really see that anywhere else. So that is very exciting that their knowledge is recognized as very important and very deep knowledge that needs to be shared and passed on. Driven by professional and community needs. So the different, the 12 Native communities in Wisconsin were all part of the process of creating this program and had input into what do you want to see the graduates do after they leave this program. And they said some unexpected things, like we want them to have these original teachings, but we also want them to be able to write a grant. We want them to be able to publish. We want them to feel comfortable in this Western world of academia so they can come back to the communities and do good work. So this prepares leaders to change institutions and promote cultural resurgence and vitality of the future for Native peoples. So I just want to give a quick plug to, I don't know how, you are probably already familiar with, there's a talk coming up, a series of conversations about First Nations peoples in Door County and beyond. So Bill Quackenbush is a HoChunk leader, and he is going to be talking next Saturday. So he will be at the Door auditorium, and then the rest of and it's free to the public. So there are going to be different Indigenous speakers. So I highly encourage everyone to attend these talks so that you can continue your own learning and dig deeper into these issues, because today I'm going to kind of be 100 miles wide and an inch deep. So this will just kind of scratch the surface. So these are some seed questions that Anna sent an email out to everyone. And I wanted to know where people are in their learning and also what you want to know. Because I would like to talk about as much as I can, things that you are interested in. So the questions that came back are incredibly sophisticated and complex. Like, people are really thinking about these issues. So I was like blown away by these questions. So I'm going to address them in this talk. I really structured the talk today around these questions so that hopefully you'll hear something that that inspires or that encourages future learning and gets at what you want to know. So I'll go through each of these as we go through. There is one question in here that I think there was a typo in it. So if the person is here who wrote the question, just let me know. It said, did any native tribes ever see all or portions of their own? And I'm not sure what that question was asking. So if anyone wants to clarify that one, let me know and I'll try to answer it. And I'll have resources and references at the end of the talk, just to keep digging in there. So before I get in there, I just want to, there are going to be terms in here, and I don't know how much everyone here knows. So I'm just going to assume that that I should probably say up front, there are different terms I'm going to be using in this talk. So Indigenous, Native, Indian, First Nations, you've probably heard these terms. I'll be using them interchangeably, but they are used in specific contexts. So this terminology is important. So the problems with, terms can be problematic because they ignore the vast cultural and language differences among Indigenous people. There's no Native American people. There's like, I don't know where we are at this point, 590 federally recognized tribes in the US, and that's just the federally recognized ones. So incredibly diverse. So I want to get out of that box of that single category, which is based on that shared experience with colonialism. That's how they're defined. So I want to get out of that box as much as I can. There's really no consensus regarding preferred wording in the legal realm. You'll see Indian, like in Canada, they have the Indian Act. So it's a term of art. So you'll see that kind of term. I don't really use it in this context. I tend to use Indigenous, which is that's more of a global catch-all term that encompasses all original peoples all around the globe. And First Nations, you'll see particularly in Canada, Canadian First Nations. The next one is Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations. Everyone knows them in school as Iroquois or the Iroquois Confederacy. I will say Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse, because I like to use the tribe's name for themselves or the people's names for themselves. And the Confederacy is the Six Nations are the Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora. HoChunk, you'll see Winnebago in different historical texts and in legal texts. Is there anything I need to do here?
Well, I'm gonna just let people in, but you are.
Oh,
good.
sure.
You can keep going.
Oh no, go for it. So just know that they're sometimes referred to as the Winnebago in Wisconsin in historical documents. They have taken back their name for themselves as HoChunk. So I'll refer to them as HoChunk, except the group that stayed in Nebraska when they were pushed out many, many times. Some of them returned back to Wisconsin. That's the HoChunk. The ones that stayed in Nebraska are the Winnebago tribe. So Winnebago, Nebraska, Wisconsin, HoChunk. Potawatomi, there are various spellings. I just use the one that the tribe uses, and Menominee. Anishinaabe is another, or Chippewa or Ojibwe. So I will use Ojibwe. That's more of like the tribal name. Anishinaabe are like the people. So that's it encompasses a bigger idea of people. And tribe and nation, this is really important to remember. Tribe is a more current political category. So the peoples who were engaging with one another pre-reservation era, late 1800s, people were moving around, mixing together in very fluid ways. So the concept of tribe, I mean, there were bands of people that may have been enemies that were linked together into one tribe. So it's just important to remember that it's a new thing. There wasn't that concept originally in Indigenous communities of those hard lines between people. So I will use nation, kind of that citizenship sort of idea. And then Western is a tricky one. I basically use that as a descriptive term for a particular way of thinking and engaging with the world. So I've been brought up in Western thinking, as opposed to as differentiated from Eastern or Indigenous thinking. So just as I do for Indigenous knowledges, I want to recognize that the Western worldview is not monolithic. It contains a rich diversity within it and contributions. So these are, hang on a second here. Did I go too far? I'm doing this on two different places. So these are the tribes that are the Indigenous peoples that have lived in the Door Peninsula since the last glacial period, which ended around 10,000 years ago. The HoChunk, originally these were one people called the Three Councils or Nishnabeg, the Odawa or Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. So they were a single people that split and became three council fires, but they share a lot of culture and language commonalities. The Menominee, Sauk, Huron, Petun, and Noque. And we have such a short amount of time together, there's no way I can get reasonably into all of that. So I'm just gonna focus on the HoChunk, the Three Council, and the Menominee. All right. So this is the HoChunk Nation. They are headquartered, the seat of government is in Black River Falls. There isn't a reservation, but they're spread around kind of the southwestern side of the state. And it means people of the big voice is the name for themselves. So to help protect their language, the nation created a special program to teach others how to speak HoChunk, to keep the language alive and to bring up new speakers. So from oral history and archaeological records and historical accounts, these are the people who were on the land that would eventually become Door County first. Some stayed, some came and went. Move forward here a little bit more. They own about 4,000 acres scattered across 12 counties in Wisconsin and one in Minnesota. The biggest concentrations of tribal citizens are in Jackson, Clark, and Monroe counties. They also own land in Linwood, Illinois. So the Forest County Potawatomi are the people of the fire. This is one of the Nishnabeg or three councils that split, and they are known as the Keepers of the Fire. So they came, the three councils kind of came from the eastern part of the US, came through here, migrating west and south, and the Potawatomi kind of went along Lake Michigan area, Wisconsin and into Illinois. Just takes me a minute because I have to do this on two screens. And then the Menominee. So this is the another original people to Wisconsin that were very prominent in the Door Peninsula. So their seat of government is in Kenosha. And you probably know about the Menominee Forest. You can see it from space. Their sustainability efforts and forest management is just, it's world renowned. It is amazing. I'm sorry, did I say, I meant Kashina, not Kenosha. Thank you. So this is, as soon as I can send this out to everyone. Flash went away last year, and there's an interactive Menominee map, which is amazing because it has place names all over in Wisconsin in the Menominee language. Because it requires Flash, I can't share it here, but if people are interested, I can send this out because this was a huge project with fluent language speakers and Stevens Point that is amazing. So just a note that. So this is the first question I will get into. Do you know of any permanent communities or long-term encampments on any of the Door County islands? If the islands weren't used for long-term living, is there evidence they were visited and used for other purposes? That kind of goes together with this other question. When and how did Indigenous people begin to settle permanently in the so-called Door Peninsula? So the entire Door County Peninsula, what I've been taught is that it has always been inhabited and called home to the HoChunk people. I've had conversations with Bill Quackenbush about this. He's going to be the guy speaking next weekend. So at least since the last glacial event, the HoChunk have always been here. Water was really the main highway for early people, which made Door County islands especially important as places for villages and encampments. Fishing, even during the winter, was good. Hunting and gathering, this was a great place to be. So there are ancient corn mounds on Washington Island that show that agriculture was practiced relatively early in the island's history. Death's Door was also a natural barrier that helped the Potawatomi survive the constant pressures from HoChunk and their Lakota allies. And they would retreat there they would kind of fall back there to get relief from those pressures. So the Jacobson Museum on Washington Island has copper ore and its collections gathered from village sites. So basically the islands were located conveniently for a lot of trade activity over the centuries. Let me go this way. So this is a map of, this is from theways.org. If you're not familiar, it is a great site with a lot of information. So these are the original homelands at the time when the early US government started entering into treaties, or when treaty making began with before the US with European nations like the British and the French. But it's also important to remember that Native peoples were also creating treaties intertribally. So for millennia before the Europeans came, there is a long history in the archaeological record and in oral history that they were already very sophisticated negotiators and bargainers and had made treaties with one another, which is something that I didn't know until I entered this program. It seems like, all right, then the Europeans came and now treaties begin. And the Native peoples were just way out of their depth, which is actually not the case. They were very incredible orators and understood what was happening. So it's important to remember that history. So exploring this question of the presence in Door County, it's also important to remember there is archaeological evidence and there is oral tradition. So these are two ways of knowing, and they sometimes tell us different things. So it's important to keep our minds open. So archaeological evidence is one way of knowing, but it is not the way. So I draw from both. So the origin stories of the HoChunk and Menominee nations place them in what was called Wisconsin as far back as the last glacial episode and beyond. So Bill Quackenbush reminded me that the origin stories tell us we have always known this area as a place called Magushkut, Red Banks. This is where we were placed by Mauna, our creator, and our first fires were lit. We know of no other home for the HoChunk people. And oral history states that they had always lived in their current homelands of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. So by the time Europeans started coming in and started writing about the Great Lakes area in the 16th century, the HoChunk were the dominant nation in this territory. Their population was in the several thousands, but they suffered severe epidemics like smallpox, diphtheria, influenza. As we've all learned, viruses are most virulent, deadly when they come into a population that has not been exposed to them before. So a lot of numbers were decimated, primarily due to these highly transmissible diseases. So in the 17th century, they got to a low of around 500 people in some estimates. And there was also competition for resources from migrating Ojibwe in the area. By the early 1800s, the HoChunk had increased to about 3,000 people. But then there was another smallpox epidemic in 1836. So the numbers really went up and down, which really impacts the picture we see of what people were doing and how they were living in this area. So these may be familiar. These are some sites that have archaeological evidence and get more into the story of the first peoples here. There's the Carty site near Sturgeon Bay. There's the Jacobson cabin on Washington Island. There's the Chief Roy Oshkosh store that is, I think it's in Egg Harbor. Is that right? Egg Harbor? Yeah, okay. There's the Ida Bay Preserve at Big Creek in Sturgeon Bay, and then there's Whitefish Dunes State Park in Sturgeon Bay. So what we know is that from the archaeological evidence anyway, is that the Door Peninsula was occupied for at least 11,500 years. So let me go down here for a second. Has anyone been to the Jacobson Museum on Washington Island? Yeah, this is a place I need to get to. So, what's that?
Yeah, it's a big resource.
Yeah, I gotta, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Jens Jacobsen, who is a Danish guy, preserved remnants of the Potawatomi village that once stood on this northwest corner of Washington Island. And so he began finding artifacts in 1930 and discovered that some of them were walking off. And he decided it was necessary to keep these artifacts on the island. So he built this rustic log cabin structure in 1931 and was called the Jacobson Museum to preserve these artifacts. There are a number of sites on both Washington Island and Rock Island. And in Ida Bay, I think it was 1992, the Sturgeon Bay Education Foundation purchased 53 acres at the intersection of 4257 and County TT. And then the Door County Museum in Sturgeon Bay and the Jacobson Museum at Washington Island near Little Lake have displays of artifacts found at various sites. Do we need to get in there again? More people, okay.
Yeah, people are joining a little late.
Okay, that's fine, that's fine. All right, we'll go to next one. So here is, let me make sure I'm going down. Washiki Ganeso in Ojibwe, his breast is shining, which was the Ojibwe name for Washington Island. And this is kind of the running the gamut of all the different names this island had, and probably some I don't list here that I just don't know of. So the earliest evidence of Potawatomi was 1641 in the archaeological records. They were called Potawatomi Islands, 1650 to 1816. Ile de Pou, which is the French name meaning Louse Island. So sounds like a fun place. And then the Huron Islands in the Jesuit records from 1670 to 1672, thereabouts. And then the Noquay Islands. The Noquay were I've seen them as like an Ojibwe band or a Menominee band that went extinct. They either died out or they kind of sort of assimilated into Menominee tribe. I'm not quite sure about that. There's some ambivalence about that in the record, but they were, for a while, they were called the Noquay Islands because they lived in what is now Big Bay de Noc in the UP. Am I saying that right? Big Bay de Noc. Okay, thank you. And then the islands of the Grand Traverse, late 1700s, Jonathan Carver bestowed that name upon the islands. And then in 1816, we have the Colonel John Miller garrisoned a new fort at the head of Green Bay to be called Fort Howard. And 3 vessels sailed from Mackinac, got separated. The Washington, the vessel named the Washington, anchored on the island, and the officers explored and said, hey, there's nobody here. Let's call this Washington Island. So that was in July of 1816, and that was where that name came in there, to name it after President George Washington. So there are a lot of stories of Native war parties being drowned in the area, hence Death's Door, Port de Mort, just a place you don't really want to get involved in a boat. So there are various accounts of boats of like 300 Indigenous folks drowning, dying in the Death's Door area. The earliest records and maps were French. So that's the written history of the region begins with these French records. They don't name the individual islands, but refer to them all as a group. So the names chosen, as you can see, depended on which group they were collaborating with, partnering with at the time. Right here on this one. So this was a question that came up. What were 2 to 3 turning points for Indigenous peoples in their existence and what eventually became Door County? And I don't think we have time for 2 to 3, but the glacial events were one of them. That changing environment after that last glacial period was one that I've heard from Menominee and HoChunk folks. That was a big one. The one I'll focus on right now is, everyone knows what this critter is that changed everything, a beaver. Go forward here. I have the Potawatomi and Menominee names for, these are other animals that were also highly prized by the European fur traders that came in. Otter, mink, ermine or weasel, fox, pine marten, but beaver was really the most sought after animal. So there is, does anyone know the Red Banks site just outside of Green Bay? Yeah. So this is where Jean Nicolet, emissary of Governor Samuel de Champlain of New France, landed in 1634. And his instructions were to set up a partnership with the Ho-Chunk because they knew the area better than anybody, and ally them with France. So he was a little bit lost. He thought they were Asian, so he dressed himself in these Chinese silk robes and sent off a couple shots to make a good first impression when he stepped on the shore. And I don't know what the Ho-Chunk were thinking, like, who's this dude? But he's very colorful and interesting, so we should probably talk with him. And he wrote back to his supervisors that he was entertained with 60 beavers being served at one banquet because they ate them. And it was the pelts, it was not the flesh, but it was the pelts of the beavers that really got his attention. Because the Europeans really wanted to trap beavers here, is because by the late 1500s, the beaver was basically extinct in Western Europe. So they were just kind of going to repeat that here. And it was close to extinction in Scandinavia and Russia. So this is a 1743 sketch by a Hudson Bay trader, James Isham. My kids like this one because the beavers look very flat. They said they kind of look like roadkill. So there are these flat little beavers swimming along, and this is his very detailed sketch of various ways to trap and kill beaver. So this is like a how-to guide. So here's how we do it. Don't ask me how exactly. I'm not clear on how exactly you hunt and trap beaver, but this is that instruction manual for how to do that for future Europeans that were going to come over. So various pelts were used for the insatiable European customs, but beaver there was this specialized felting process that beaver fur made a fabric that was just amazingly soft and malleable. It was water resistant. I remember my aunt had a beaver. She had it from her mom. It wasn't a stole. It was like it was a coat, and the collar was beaver, and we weren't allowed to touch it. We could like touch it once, and it was the most amazing thing I've ever felt. But then don't touch it. So that was like her most prized possession, was this amazing beaver collared coat. So Robert La Salle, late 17th century French explorer, did a very brisk business with the Ho-Chunk and other native peoples. So to transport the furs quickly and at less expense, he had a boat built at Cayuga Creek above Niagara Falls, and he called it Le Griffin. And in 1679, the Griffin left Mackinac and arrived a few days later at Detroit Harbor on Washington Island, the first sailing vessel to appear on the Great Lakes. And then the pelts were loaded, and then the Griffin lifted anchor, and then it got lost and was never heard from again. So dangerous business. So here are some, I gotta go forward on both of these. Let me see if I can move this over so we can see a little bit better.
Would shrink it.
Sorry, Sarah, thank you. Should have done that a while ago. So these were on the bottom left, there is a felted beaver hat. And these are all the stylish varieties of hats and the years that they were in fashion. So the native peoples were really wanting to get iron projectile points and kettles, these brass kettles and beads. These are some fur trade beads in the mid 1700s that were very prized. So it was really beneficial in the beginning, at least on both sides. Everyone got what they wanted. Trouble came later, but in the beginning, this seemed like a good deal for everybody. And it's impossible to state how much the fur trade changed everything. It was literally the economic engine of the European nations and the native nations. And as they got more drawn into this exchange, it just undergirded all of their economic activity, and they couldn't get out of it even if they wanted to. So this fur trade drew the French into close and constant proximity to the native peoples. They depended on them for harvesting and processing and transportation, and also for their services as guides and intermediaries. The native nations knew this and used that to their advantage in every step of the way. So they would forge alliances with the French or the British, depending on which way the winds were blowing. The main fur trade nations were in Canada and the Hurons in the first half of the 17th century and the Potawatomi in the second half. So because these goods were so highly desirable, these alliances ensured that both sides became deeply enmeshed in one another's economies, societies, politics. So this was more than that exchange of commodities. It also was an interchange of knowledge and technology and culture and language. And it underpinned these powerful military coalitions and gave rise to new cultural forms and identities. So you'll see old photographs of these native guys with their top hats. And it's really a blend of these European goods and their own material culture that are coming together in really fascinating ways. So this is getting to that question that someone asked. This started to change how the tribes interacted with one another as well. So the Hudson Bay Company was started by 3 Frenchmen in Nova Scotia and started competing with the French for furs in Door County and elsewhere. So these were complex alliances between the native nations and the French and British that led to a series of wars. Then by the 1820s, the beaver populations were so low that the Hudson Bay Company, I didn't know this, introduced some of the first conservation measures to help increase the population. So this is one of the earliest examples that we know of conservation efforts. So I thought that was really interesting. What really saved the beaver was silk hats came into fashion. So fur hats are out, silk hats are in. So silkworm, next victim, unfortunately, but silk was all the rage. So that's when, end of the 1830s, fur trade started to die out. Go forward. To what extent did the different native people tolerate one another, and how did that change over the centuries? So what I have heard from Menominee folks is that they were the diplomats. Their guiding philosophy was epicon acquis, which I'm not saying properly, or we all sit upon the earth. So when they were treating intertribally, their goal was to maintain stability. Like if we all get along, we all do better, was their philosophy. So then the Europeans arrived and they continued that role. They wanted to maintain that stability in trading and in the treaty process with these European nations. The Menominee and the Noque were smaller, so they didn't have that same military might that the Lakota or the HoChunk may have had. So they really positioned themselves as diplomats between the larger tribes, affecting trade and other exchanges. And other tribes coexisted just fine for long periods of time. But then when resources were short for some reason or another and competition increased, then you see conflict happening. And then there's always the usual human frailties of jealousy and envy that could cause internal conflict within a tribe or external conflicts with other tribes. So there is quite a substantial record of struggles between warring tribes. The HoChunk and the Potawatomi, for example, were competitive in the early 1600s until the French came with their fur trade. The Haudenosaunee drove some of the eastern tribes from upper Michigan south along the North Shore for a while. So that's when you start to see like the Huron and the Sauk coming in to the Door County area. The Haudenosaunee really threw their weight around. They were the most powerful in the eastern part of the United States. So you'll see kind of refugees of that conflict coming into this area for a shorter period of time. So from 1628 to 1815, the Potawatomi participated in 9 major conflicts. So the Beaver Wars, the Fox Wars, the French and Indian War, Pontiac's War, the American Revolutionary War, and Northwest Indian Wars, the Osage War, the Battle of Tippecanoe, and the Battle of 1812. So that's a lot. That's a lot that was happening, and changed the culture very deeply. So Bill Quackenbush told me that the HoChunk, we are a warrior type society, but we have always been a people of peace. During recent history, after the first Europeans arrived in our region, the area became a very busy place with various groups coming into our area, and this caused a lot of strife. So oral history indicates that in the mid-16th century, the influx of Ojibwe peoples in the northern part of their lands caused the HoChunk to move to the south of their territory. And then they came into some friction with the Illinois Confederacy. After peace was established between the French and the Iroquois in 1701, many of the Ojibwe returned to their homelands in the east. And then the HoChunk were relieved of that pressure for a little while and went back out of Illinois and returned back to their original homelands. So basically, this is all to say that these relations changed constantly. So sometimes skirmishes were small. They might have been confined to family or clan groups. Sometimes they were large, like the effort to cross Death's Door in canoes to destroy the Potawatomi that resulted in a lot of warriors drowning. And like I said before, that started to change drastically with the fur trade. I thought this was a really interesting one. Did significant differences exist between the acceptance of Native peoples by different ethnic groups, nationalities that settled in Door County? So in Door County, there's the Moravians from what's now the Czech Republic, the Swedes, the Germans, the Irish, various Scandinavian peoples, the French. So you've got all different, this medley of different ethnic groups coming in. It seemed the historical record seems to say that the French were largely accepted by the Native people here. Some people accepted the early English folks coming in, but as the population pressures increased, that acceptance turned to distrust. And then in late 1600, you started to get a bigger influx of European trappers and traders and settlers in Door County, which steadily increased until the early 1800s. So by the time the Americans and the immigrants came to the peninsula and islands, there were some accommodations that were made to kind of live together. But none of these invaders, as they were called, were where they ought to be. So individual people and families from different nationalities and tribes did not get along well, but the prejudice against Indians was also pretty widespread. They were largely seen as an obstacle to overcome. And from what I've seen on Washington Island, European settlers didn't really get in there until the 1830s, so a little bit later there. The settlers were on their way to Green Bay, and they heard there's some really big trout up there, so they hightailed it up to Washington Island. Most of those settlers were Icelandic and Irish. And then you get into the treaty period in Wisconsin history, and that forced tribes onto reservations controlled by the War Department. Indian Affairs was in the War Department, so that tells you how that was going. Or they were moved out of Wisconsin altogether, like the HoChunk. So a lot of Native people vacated Door County before most of the treaties were finalized. And more settlers kept coming in. So I'm sure there were people in each ethnic group that tried to make the best of the situation and get along on an individual level. But the larger policy was that as settlers came in, the tribes would say, hey, what's going on? What are these people doing here? These are our treaty lands or our trust lands. And the government would say, too bad, so sad. So they did nothing. So that larger policy was there early on. Has anybody seen this map? This is, does it look, anyone? Yeah.
I had a question about the Black Hawk.
Here, let me just. So this is the Wisconsin First Nations website developed in a partnership with DPI, Department of Public Instruction, School of Education at Madison, and Wisconsin Public Television. So this is showing the 12 nations. Brothertown is not federally recognized, but I count them in there. So these are the nations in Wisconsin today. So the closest one here is Oneida right there. So you can see this kind of blob here. These are the HoChunk Trust Lands, Forest County Potawatomi Trust Lands. So this is, you can see how spread out the HoChunk are there. So it was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced thousands of Native people to walk from their homes in the Great Lakes and East Coast regions to Indian territory. So some of them were pushed out a lot into Oklahoma, or into Minnesota or Iowa, Nebraska in the case of the HoChunk. There are no federally recognized tribes in Illinois. So there are a lot of Native people there, but not federally recognized. Let's go to the next, go down. We're doing on time. I gotta stop soon. I'm over time. This was a question from a lady about mounds. Like, was there a mound building culture in Door Peninsula? So this is a map provided by my friend Kevin Cullen, who was curator at the Neville Museum. He's at the Maritime Museum, and he said that there were, it's a difficult question, most likely there is evidence in Door of mounds, burial mounds. I don't know about effigy mounds. I haven't heard anything about effigy mounds, but definitely burial mounds. And just really quickly, this is, what do we know, if anything, about the concept of land as property? First developed in Door County. How did Native peoples perceive those taking what was seen as land rather than property? So that concept of land as property is a European concept, a codified concept in common English law. The French were looser about many European conventions and more apt to have families with Native women. On the Door Peninsula and the islands, the influx of French families was also relatively light. So early settlers defended their land where they'd built a cabin, or earlier the French defended their trading posts, but people could mostly go find a plot of land and say, here's where I'm going to be, and live there as long as they could hold it and make a living fishing, gardening, or trapping. So that concept of land ownership took over as the white population expanded and dominated the peninsula and the islands. I want to make sure we have time for land acknowledgements. This is the very end of what I'm going to talk about. That land acknowledgement we did at the very beginning, just to talk about why they're important and why you're probably seeing more and more of them happening right now. So just to talk about what's going on with land acknowledgements. So this is the land acknowledgement from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, the First Nations Department at UWGB. My professors, Lisa Poupart and JP Leary, and others at the university were really, and as well as elder teachers in the program, and Indigenous communities in the state, all kind of pushed for this to happen, and it's long overdue. So I think in the fall of 2018, the chancellor at the incoming freshman address read this land acknowledgement. And so that was a big deal. That had never been done before. So it just says that we at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of this region. The HoChunk Nation and the Menominee are the original First Peoples, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. And then it lists the different nations that they acknowledge. If you go to their website, which I have at the end, you can see a brief video that they do. And they have more resources about if your institution wants to create a land acknowledgement, kind of how to go about doing that. And in the syllabi and Green Bay at the end, the land acknowledgement is the end of your syllabus, which is also pretty cool. Let's go forward. So there is the institutional level land acknowledgement, like what the Ridges has done. You can also do this personally. So with the kids last year, we did our own land acknowledgement because they were curious, like we live in what's now called Denmark, Wisconsin. And so we're just outside of Green Bay, and like, who would have been here? Who would have been walking through here? Who would have been living here? So we created our own land acknowledgement based on that research we did. So in my email, just to kind of bring this into everyday life, I have a very brief, I acknowledge that I live and work on the ancestral homelands of the HoChunk Nation and Menominee Nation. I have a couple of friends who have done their own. This friend of mine lives in Illinois, and this one is a curator at the Field Museum in Chicago. The Field Museum is doing a lot with their new Natives of North America Hall that's going to be opening up next year, which would be fantastic to check out when it opens. One of the exhibit developers has this in his email. So you can have it be as short or as long as you want it to be. So that's at that individual level. But the reason to do this is that it's our responsibility, I think, to tell the stories of the people who came here before us and to celebrate the people who are still here and that resilience and adaptation that they have within them to be here today. And I really believe that if we acknowledge and celebrate that, we all benefit from that. We all are better and we all rise in that. It's not just about here's what we're doing for you. It's about we're doing this for ourselves as well as non-Native people. That's just what my take on that. This is the land acknowledgement at Fallen Timbers where I work. There's the Three Sisters Garden, and it has some signage right next to it that show just greetings in different languages, just something simple that kids can look at and get kind of a step into. The land acknowledgement is a first step. It's not do this and we're done. It's that first step into recognizing tribal sovereignty. So you got to keep going. There's the Three Sisters Garden, and there's the signage there. And it just has like Menominee, Ojibwe, Oneida, English bottom. This is the Field Museum in Chicago. This is a great video to watch called We Are All on Native Land, to disrupt. It's meant to disrupt that colonial narrative and to get out of the box and to start a conversation. And here's the one for the ridges again. And I'm not going to read this, but this is Adrienne Thunder she's the wife of J.P. Leary, one of our faculty at Green Bay, and she heads up the language division for HoChunk. And so she brings in tribal sovereignty is about land rights and governing our own affairs and language and culture and food sovereignty, growing the foods we would have eaten, hunting and fishing. It's like a Rubik's Cube of all these different issues that work together in really complex ways. So this is what those land acknowledgements are getting at, supporting that tribal sovereignty issue. So that is the end of what I have got. And I'm gonna leave it there. I just want to say, I want to acknowledge this collective knowing that I drew from Bill Quackenbush, Carol Binns. She's the owner of the Chief Oshkosh store. What's that? Colleen Binns. I wrote her name in incorrectly. You're right. Colleen Binns. I will change that. Ben Greeno and Lucy Burr at Menominee Nation, and Thomas Davis. Does anyone know Tom Davis? Yeah. So I have his, I'm going to plug him at the end and brag on him a little bit. Donald Keeble, who's a Potawatomi educator, and Adrienne Thunder, HoChunk Language Division. So here's Thomas Davis. This is a great book he has about the Menominee and sustainability and forestry practices. So if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. He lives in Sturgeon Bay. He's been working with the Menominee. He was a big part of getting the College of Menominee Nation going. So he is a non-native ally. So he is like, yeah, he's a pretty cool guy. So he's retired provost at Navajo Technical University. And so I'm going to plug, he's doing a new historical fiction novel about Potawatomi Indoor County. Yeah. So that's coming out later this year, maybe early next year. You have something to add?
Well, it's very interesting that he was the administrative expert in building the Indigenous college system, which has actually gone all over the world now.
Yes.
Encouraging Indigenous people to develop courses that can be accredited.
Yeah.
And it's very important. He's written a little poetry book available.
Yeah.
About that.
He is an amazing man. So we are, I'm happy to know him. And so you can, yeah, definitely check him out. So Miigwech, Wewenin, Haikau Jewi, thank you for listening. I'm gonna be done talking so that others can ask questions. Did someone have I just have some resources at the end that I drew from for the presentation. These are institutions that are doing this work. They're doing it. They're changing the narrative. They're uplifting Indigenous communities, and they're teaching the public. So check these out. I also have a toolkit for allies and educators that I can get out to everybody. So just to continue continue your learning. And then there's references at the end. So this is all in here for you to have. Yes.
You're all wondering what that bear.
Yes. But all you want to do is sleep, but colonialism and the patriarchy won't leave you alone. So that's from Decolonial Meme Queens. They got some hilarious memes. So yeah. So does anyone, yeah.
I just want to add, in August, the Door County Board made a land acknowledgement. I believe we're the first county board in the state to do so.
Oh, wow. That's
So,
fantastic.
something you can add to your research.
That is great to know. You said this past August?
Yeah.
Okay,
It was
that's fantastic.
an interesting process.
I bet.
Didn't pass unanimously, but I think the vote was 15 to 5 or something like that.
Okay.
There were some people who didn't.
It's a lightning rod.
Yes.
It is definitely a lightning rod. Yeah, but it sounds like the majority were for it. So there is kind of a tipping point that we seem to be hitting where there's always going to be that resistance. But it seems like things are shifting in a good way. So that's good.
Yeah, I
Good
think
news.
I think we're the first. I don't think there's any others.
Yeah.
So other than Menominee.
Yeah.
They acknowledge their own existence.
I'm sure. I don't know. That would be good to find out. Any someone you
I
have?
had a thought, oh,
Diamond Coquados,
Yes.
the Potawatomi was very good.
Yes. That was one thing Tom Davis was talking about. Yes.
There are caches of letters that he wrote to many of the historians of that time. There's one to George Wing that I was able to
Yeah.
locate in Green Bay. It's about
Okay.
50 pages, and they're
Oh, wow.
remarkable letters. But he was able to learn to read and write English.
Yeah.
Very difficult task for
Yeah.
anybody. But there's a tremendous volume of information that must still be out in many different archives.
Where did you find that in Green Bay? Do you remember where you that?
In the archive,
Okay.
in the library.
Okay. I think we had someone in Zoom
Yeah, we
who was
have a
trying to
few
say
questions.
something. Okay.
yeah, I had my hand up.
Okay.
All right.
There's a lady here with her hand up.
Oh,
There's a lady. Excuse me. When I lived in Mexico in the early 70s, I ran into an archaeologist who had been on Rock Island and was studying the effects of the Black Hawk Wars.
Mhm.
And I didn't hear you mention that, but she said that the problem that they ran into was that various nations were being pushed back by the British during the French and Indian mess. And when they landed in Wisconsin, they had kind of the approach of take no prisoners. You know, if you catch them, that's it, you kill them or you keep them. Whereas the woodland Indians, their approach was if you catch them, just count the numbers and return them to their people. And the numbers mean you're winning. And since they had different rules of warfare, it didn't work out too well.
Yes.
But especially for Wisconsin,
Yeah.
that
So
was on Rock Island that she found a lot of the evidence for this.
on Rock Island.
In the late 60s and early 70s. So
Okay. So I probably couldn't hear, but this lady was talking about the Black Hawk War and the effects on intertribal relations and relations with Europeans and the taking of captives practices, where in woodland tribes you could add another number to your community. There was versus like the take no prisoners kind of philosophy, and that kind of, I mean, tribes would raid on one another all the time, and they would take captives and they would become integrated into that community. So there was that again, that more fluid kind of philosophy about you're with us now and you are now for all intents and purposes one of us. This is something that comes up a lot in conversations that I have had when I've worked with the Oneida Nation about blood quantum and enrollment issues. And people bring up over and over again, our philosophy has always been adoption was very common and intermarriage, and then you become part of that community. And that has kind of been lost in the colonizing process, which is where we are now with blood quantum.
The Iroquois and
So
the
that made me
Eastern
think about that
tribes
too, your question.
I'm just saying that the Eastern, the Iroquois, they did not have that tradition. It was catch them and kill them.
Yeah. They probably didn't need the numbers. They didn't need to, well, so especially if you've got an epidemic that wipes out half your population, yeah, you're going to want to take prisoners of war and bolster your numbers. And the Haudenosaunee were so large and powerful, they, I think, had the luxury of not needing to do that. But if you're the HoChunk and there's 500 of you left, yeah, you're gonna want to increase your numbers. Yes.
The
Was this?
Haudenosaunee kind of have acquired some very erroneous identities because they would adopt entire tribes. They had a very detailed system of here's our great law of peace.
Yep.
Accept it, then you will become Seneca.
Mm-hmm.
So each of the larger tribes so many of the enemies of the tribes further west would say, okay, now we are Iroquois. They learn all the techniques of battle.
Yeah.
But they'd be much more, the actual league had very detailed. They were very merciful.
Yeah.
But it just became, with the French and the English pitting them against each other, it just became chaos.
Yeah. Yep.
Kevin, do you mind repeating that for the ones?
So one of the folks here was saying that just getting again into that history of that fluid, like that, this like nationalism of we have these hard boundaries of we are these people, you are those people, was not part of that Indigenous worldview, that he was using the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois as an example, that saying you are now part of us, and then expanding that realm of influence and strengthening the Confederacy. And the Confederacy came out of a time of very intense intertribal warfare, and they got to the point where they're like, we can't live like this, so we need to find another way to collaborate and come together, which is great for our times right now to think about this. We are at this dysfunctional point, and we need to do things differently. And so the Great Law of Peace and that more collaborative kind of philosophy came out of that time of intense intertribal warfare, and made them much stronger. Was there another question? I'm just trying to make sure I'm tracking here and here.
Yeah, we have a few questions from people online.
Okay.
One person asked if you could define food sovereignty.
Oh, yes. So I should put this in there. There is an Oneida woman named Becky Webster who is really at the forefront in our area of leading food sovereignty efforts. So I'll send out her their site Ngwakwa, which means our foods. She's doing YouTube videos teaching people how to recover all this knowledge that was lost, which is how to raise traditional foods, how to process them, how to eat them, and we're all healthier as a result. So getting away from GMO foods and getting back to heirloom varieties that were grown in this region. And they work well and grow well for a reason, because they are naturalized to the area. So, so food sovereignty is about revitalizing that knowledge and the language around that. So they like food and language go together. So when you're revitalizing food traditions, you're revitalizing the language at the same time, which brings back that worldview. So it's part of that decolonizing effort. It's part of honoring those knowledges and making our bodies healthier in the process. Like our bodies are handle certain foods better. So let's eat the foods that our ancestors ate for health. So it's kind of all of those things. Does that answer your question? That was a very short. Okay.
We do have one other question. Somebody asked if you know what tribes resided in the Two Rivers area.
That would likely still be, let's go back to our map. HoChunk, Potawatomi. Let's go back here. And I mean, it's hard to, because it changes so much over time, but for the longest stretch of time, that would be Potawatomi and that would be Menominee and HoChunk. So this is just a snapshot of a particular point in time. So you got to try to think of it more fluidly, but the longest standing presence would be Menominee, HoChunk, Potawatomi, is my understanding. Yeah.
My research is indicating that the earliest European records were that it was all of the Door County and the Traverse Islands and clear down to Milwaukee was Potawatomi.
Yeah.
But that was the, and they may have come from the north rather than a larger group of Potawatomi that was coming from Michigan.
Yeah.
Around bottom. That was a different, that was a little different band.
Yeah.
Or group, but that they dominated. Alloway said he wished he could just spend all his time on that shore because the Potawatomi was so nice.
Yeah.
And the Potawatomi were only there because of the hospitality of the Menominee.
Yes.
The Menominee land
There-
for 9,000 years.
Yeah.
And then the Potawatomi showed up coming from east.
Right.
And
And-
I wonder if you're familiar with Alice Kehoe's work. She's and I think this map is closer to what, you know, I would challenge us to not be quite so HoChunk centric. HoChunk probably didn't have much influence up here. They have oral ties and clan stories that go back to Red Banks, but where they came from before that, I mean, sometimes they talk about coming from Aztlan, you know, associated with Cahokia. They definitely brought a different mindset. They were more challenging to their neighbors. I mean, there's a reason the HoChunk were almost wiped off the map when they were starving in 1646, and the Illinois tribe brought up food. They celebrated with the food that was brought, and then they ate the men that brought the food. Okay, the HoChunk to this day still joke about putting the Menominee in their stew pot. So the HoChunk have a very different mindset. The Menominee lived here, and they viewed the world as their raspberry patch. They, like you said, they were the diplomats. They were open. They were much more egalitarian and more, you know, hunter-gatherer. Move where the resource was.
Yeah.
And so Alice's work, she speaks of it. She's got a really great language on knowledge. Check her.
Okay. Yeah.
She speaks of Menominee being basically being close to this region, and they had a Freeport mentality that yes, when the Potawatomi came from the east, because the prophet said, "Get the hell out of the East Coast because the shit's about to hit the fan." You know,
It's time
the
to
Menominee
move.
said, "Yeah, you can spend time." And when the HoChunk moved north to Red Banks, whether they took it by force of arms or whether it was by treaty or agreement, the Menominee said, "Sure, you can hang out in these productive places, take over, you know, use our wild rice beds and keep fish from our land, you know, our land." So I think the Menominee don't get enough credit. They've been here longest. They always seem like they've always been the nicest, although like they said, the Potawatomi came and had a pretty good reputation as well.
And the Oneida as well. So when the Oneida were being relocated out here in the 1820s and 30s, the Menominee were again taking on that role of, all right, let's make the best of what's happening and let's find a way to coexist. right? Yes. So, yes.
Yeah, a related question to that too, River.
Yeah.
A lot of us that live up here in Door County are highly curious about, hey, who lives here? You know,
Yeah.
whether it's at Bridges or in Davis Harbor or wherever it is. Have you found any good resources that try to get specific in those? And I know it's complicated over a century, but it's like over the last century before the Indian.
Can't hear at all.
Yeah, there's someone for those out there in Zoomverse who can't hear. There's a question about resources for, because a lot of folks here are, live here. Like this is a very different conversation than would be in the summertime when there would be more visitors and tourists coming through. A lot of folks live here full time. So he was asking about more that curiosity and that hunger for knowledge and knowing more about the peoples who are in this area. So when I talked with Thomas Davis, he recommended some really great historical books that you can look up. This Conan B. Eaton, and where's the other one? JP Schumacher is another one, getting at that historical context for who was here when. And then Father Hennepin writing in the early 1900s. So those are getting at that historical piece. So that was what the question was. So I was just referring everyone to this references section where you can go check out more and do some of your own research as well. Patty Lowe, she's at Northwestern now. She's Bad River, Ojibwe, and she's written some great books as well. Those are going to be broader, but if you want to really dig in there, there's some good pieces in here. Yes.
Would you mention the Oneota? Is there any evidence that the HoChunk and the Oneota have a direct link, or?
That I don't. You're not talking about Oneoteaga, the Oneida. You're talking about the Oneota.
It's interesting that that whole archaeological culture, it was discovered first in the Oneota Valley, which is down here. It's in Iowa. Yeah. And that was the Iowa's name for this valley, which has standing rocks. And Oneota means standing rocks in the Oneida language. Yeah, the people of the Standing Rock. Right. Yep. But we have at Hines Creek, there's one of the richest deposits of Oneota archaeological evidence. Pots. Yeah. Well, and I think that gets at this pre-European contact and then continuing into that period. Native nations had extensive trade networks that extended all the way down into Mexico, from Canada down into Mexico and beyond, where you had seeds traveling back and forth, and you had language and cultural practices, ways of dressing. So you'll find like quahog shells from the East Coast in places like Iowa or in Nebraska. And I think that's just, and the assumption 100 years ago was that, Europeans must have done that, and not taking into account a complex established network of trade where you see names and similarity, like language overlaps and code and borrowing words and phrases that come up. But as far as the Oneota and that history, I don't know. That's outside of my abilities today. I know it's something that a lot of people are working, but it's very difficult to connect archaeological evidence with existing practice. Yeah. Well, and that's where talking with the people that are here today and getting into that oral history, and there is this the skepticism about oral history that because it's oral and not written down, it must be flawed.
it must be, as if written history is not flawed. But there's a tendency that I see that if it's not in the archaeological record, that the oral history is not seen as not as good as, or not as accurate as. So that's why I'm trying to draw from both and see them as valid different ways of getting these stories. So I encourage everyone to, this was good for me because I don't have my focus is more on contemporary tribal policies and like what the Oneida have been doing with having conversations about blood quantum and enrollment. So the current current nation building efforts. So the history is something that I really needed to dig into and learn more about. So that's what I appreciated about doing this talk, because it got me outside of my comfort zone. Because I'm more in the, kind of so I encourage everyone to think about Native peoples as existing today and to follow what's going on, and to, I just think in school we're taught, here are these Native peoples, here's the fur trade, the end. And we're kind of left there. And so I want to encourage us to think about right now, the here and now. Here we go.
One more question.
Okay. Oh, look at.
They are a relative of Grace Claflin, who is the
Oh, yeah.
first white settler in Door County.
Yes.
There's many stories, and they were wondering if you had any information about that, or maybe his relationship with.
Totally adversarial,
I would
not a good story.
go to the, yeah. There's the Door County. I would refer that question, because I would not be able to answer that as well as the exhibits that are up, like at Door County Historical Museum, or is there another resource or place up here that would have some more information about him? But I would, I'll have to pass the buck on that one. But I have, so I would contact the lovely folks at the Door County Historical Museum, or you can contact the folks at Green Bay Cofran Library, get into the archives. Do you have something?
Recite the little story that in several very old newspapers, that he had a very good relationship with Potawatomi, but his son-in-law began exploiting them and using liquor as his prybar.
Yeah.
And the Potawatomi became very enraged at his practices, and they held him and increased Claflin's daughter prisoner. And Increase said, well, we'll settle this. I have something. And he went to his cabin, came out with a barrel of gunpowder and a lit match. He said, either you can let them go or we will all go.
Oh my.
And
it's one way to negotiate.
So he said, this guy's crazy. Potawatomi left, and that's when he left the rest of the settlers were more in sync with his son-in-law.
Okay.
That's when that winter he left for Mago Shikani, good place for fishing, which that he called Fish Creek.
Yeah.
So that's when
good trout. Okay.
To escape the other settlers and to try and reestablish.
Yeah.
That's the story I have.
I don't know if I can translate all of that. You should probably get up here and just speak in there. Great. Yeah.
We did have one more question. Could you explain blood quantum?
Oh God. So yeah, I'm always curious, like people either seem to really be up on this or they're like, I have no idea. Does anyone have heard the term before?
What is the term?
Blood quantum. So blood quantum is your mathematical fraction of how much like I am a quarter Irish, so I'm 25%, as far as I know, whatever that means. So to enroll in a tribe, you have to prove, you have to have your paperwork, right? Because we're in colonial systems. It's not who our family is. You have to show a piece of paper to say, I am at least a quarter. That's a really common, a common minimum of blood for that specific tribe. So you had the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, and that's when you started seeing these kind of boilerplate constitutions that were created by the Indian agents for these different tribes. And blood quantum was written in there into these constitutions that you have to show, like some tribes are 3/4 or some tribes are half. So, but a quarter is pretty common. So Oneida is a quarter. So you've got to show that your grandparents were at least whatever it is, 50 full blood. You have to show that you have that, and then you can enroll. However, it's very fraught because blood quantum started with, you had like the Dawes, you had these census takers that would come and visit tribes in the late 1800s, like the 1880s. And they're like, we got to count all these Indian people and who they are and where they live. This guy has dark skin. He's full blood. His brother, who may be his full brother, is a little bit lighter. He's half. And they created these insane charts because we've got to, like bloodlines, like racehorses, we got to document bloodlines. That's very important to our European way of thinking. So we're going to document everybody. And these completely bonkers fractions were placed on people, and it literally split families apart because they wanted to take away this collective land ownership philosophy and individualize it into land allotments. So we need to know who you are and how much blood you have, and then we'll give you your parcel of land. So it's an incredibly divisive, like, talk about lightning rod issues. Like my folks I work with, they are enrolled, their kids are not enrolled, or their grandkids won't be able to be enrolled. So at the rate of marrying out and having kids with someone who is not your tribe, which Native people, by the way, do more than any other group in the United States, at the rate that things are going, there will be no tribes legally. So what do tribes do? So that's the $64,000 question is, do you go to lineal descent where you just show that your like Aunt Dot is on the original Dawes rolls, and if you can establish that link, you can enroll regardless of blood quantum? What does it mean to be Oneida if it's not blood quantum? So that's the question that tribes are, not just the Oneida, but tribes all over the country are asking themselves as they have people having fewer babies and those children not being able to enroll. What's going to happen? So that is what I've been working on with in a supportive role, because I don't have the answers and it's not my place to say what the answer is to that question. The tribes need to figure that out, find their way of answering that question. So that is what the book that I co-edited with Norbert Hill, Great Vanishing Act, Blood Quantum and the Future of Native Nations. And it's an anthology of all these different Native scholars and artists and writers who answer that question in different ways. Yeah. That's all the questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for attending in person. If you are attending virtually, thank you as well. We will send a follow-up email to everybody who attended both in person and virtually with the resources that Kathleen shared with us today. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. My email is anna@ridgessanctuary.org, and I can forward those questions to Kathleen as well. We are also hoping to have a recording of this presentation available if you'd like to go back and watch and learn more. So hopefully we'll have that available on our website by next week. So yeah, thank you, everyone.